Hello. So this is our second weekly video for Theories of Crime. Um, so today what we're going to do is I'm going to start by addressing some of the questions that you had on your discussion board about Travis Hershey and control theory. And then we will talk a little about Howard Becker and labeling theory. Which is the reading you're going to have for today, a chapter from Howard Becker's Outsiders, which you should have probably started by now. Okay, so a couple of things. One, make sure that you're keeping straight that self-control theory and social control theory are separate theories. So they're by the same person, they're both a form of control theory, but they work quite differently. So with social control theory, you are being controlled by your social attachments. With self-control theory, you are being controlled by the self-control that you have developed. Somebody had a question about timeline, when these things occur. So for social control theory, anytime you gain attachments, you can essentially become controlled. Those attachments can happen later in life, they can happen earlier in life. There's no specific expiration date. Also, in my last video I commented that for self-control theory, once you fail to develop self-control, you never have it. For social control theory, that's not true. A person can be criminal at one point, develop those attachments, and then no longer be criminal. So for social control theory, that sort of like aging out thing isn't a problem. For self-control, it is. For self-control theory, you develop self-control in childhood. You cannot develop it later in life. In fact, Hershey says that if you haven't developed self-control by the age of 9, it's a developmental theory. It grows more out of cognitive psychology than something social. So if you haven't developed self-control by age of 9 for Hershey's self-control theory, then you never will. Your brain will be incapable of developing it. Okay, another note I have here is that somebody brought up minor crimes. Do we age out of minor crimes? Which is a very interesting idea. Do people stop speeding at a certain age? Do they stop, doing rolling stops at stop signs or jaywalking? And I think here too, like, it makes me think about how does this relate to self and social control? Is there kind of a flaw to self or social control theory insofar as talking about minor crime, it's not really capable of doing it? Like jaywalking, like my attachments to people have nothing to do with my willingness to jaywalk because the cost of it is so low. So does it explain that kind of criminality well? And in terms of self-control theory, if we started thinking about minor crimes and breaking of minor crimes, does any of us have self-control, or is self-control just sort of this illusory thing? I think it's an interesting question. That's just playing off of something that somebody had written. Lastly, there was a discussion chain on Hershey and the use of the word morality. What does he mean when he's saying that criminology has in the past perceived people as naturally moral? One thing to say, Hershey doesn't view people as naturally moral. He views them in some degrees as naturally immoral. And in particular, there were some questions about, like, how is he using that word moral? And I would say that Hershey is simply using it in a colloquial sense. So when we say that somebody's a moral person, we mean that they're a good person. It's like he doesn't have a theory of morality. He's not trying to create some sort of philosophy of ethics here. Why does he use that word? Why doesn't he just say, like, oh, criminology in the past generally viewed people as good people? It's because he actually means this is sort of like a weird sideways slam on existing theories of crime at his time. So that would be social learning theory and anime theory, things like that. So for Hershey, he's trying to point out that there's something fuzzy about it. So like in a lot of ways, there in the social sciences, you're rarely going to get a discussion of morality where they define morality or talk about what is it or isn't moral. That's solidly the wheelhouse of philosophy, which uses very different methods. It's hard to show morality empirically. Same thing with, and sometimes I've noticed comments, quite a few comments on choice that, like, particularly like free will and whether these theories, Hershey's theories, allow for free will, and that being a flaw of it. And once again, in social sciences, you're rarely going to see a discussion of free will for the same reason. It's hard to display empirically. How do you show? How do you measure free will? That doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It means that it's sort of just outside the purview of the social sciences. It's a different, you have to go to a different place on campus to find the people who have the tools to discuss free will or tools to discuss morality. And so in some ways why Hershey's using this word morality and saying, oh, criminologists generally speaking, view people as naturally moral, and that's a mistake. He uses that because he's trying to say that they have this sort of like underlying assumption that's somewhat fuzzy, right? They have this underlying assumption that people are generally good people following and conforming and doing right, and he's trying to say that there's an ethical standpoint that they're biased towards. They're biased towards thinking well of people. Whether or not that's true, I'm not utterly confident that I agree with Hershey on his assessment of existing theories. Conformity can be moral or amoral, and depending on what you're conforming to, you think about, people, and so like what pops in my mind is like somebody who hides somebody during a genocide. They're breaking the law. What they're doing is illegal. They're being criminals. Is it moral? Well, yeah. So in a question like whether people are criminal or non-criminal, whether they break the law or follow the law, whether they conform to it or don't conform to it, can be moral or amoral. But what you get is that generally people do conform, and what does that mean? So those are just some thoughts, sort of playing off of the discussion boards. You guys did a great job. There was a lot of good depth, good discussions across, and I'll look forward to hearing your guys' next one, or reading your guys' next one. I can't hear it. You guys get to hear me. I don't get to hear you. So for this week we're doing labeling theory. Labeling theory is very closely tied to social learning theories. So for labeling theories is also a theory where we learn from other people to be criminal, but it doesn't focus on, so like a lot of the theories we were looking at focus specifically on people's actions, what they did, right? And how they learned to do what they did, or how they learned to excuse what they did, right? So it's this sort of like the action is being set up by learning a specific worldview, a certain skill set. For labeling theory, they're not interested in that as a phenomenon as much. They wouldn't necessarily deny its significance, but it's not its focus. Instead, its focus is on the identity of criminals, the important place of learning an identity as somebody who breaks the law. This is a part of labeling theory in a lot of ways can be viewed as part of a larger literature we already seen a little bit with Sykes and Mansa, and that's the preservation of self literature, understanding ourselves in the world, gaining these identities, preserving a positive identity despite, right, having some sort of stigmatized identity. And for people who are criminals, what Howard Becker, who's the major figure for labeling theory, wants to point out is that we learn to view ourselves as somebody who is a criminal, and that may itself become a positive identity. You may positively identify with your role as criminal. You can think of this as people, sort of like the posturing of crime or something like that, or even like, you know, people who use drugs and view this as like a way of expanding their mind, right? It's a positive identity with their criminality. They might identify as a drug user, but they might not identify with that as being something wrong or bad. You can think about like even like crime movies, things like, you know, mafia movies, and the way in which people will view themselves as, you know, sort of like kings among men, you know, strong and powerful. These are positive identifications with a criminal role. And so labeling theory is interested in how is it that we develop these criminal identities. And largely it's going to say we develop a criminal identity, like in general social psychology, particularly brands of symbolic interactionism, we talked about that earlier, is going to see us as learning who we are from other people from the outside. So like the fact that I think of myself as, you know, a intellectual is something that somebody at some point gave me a label as, right? So you can think about like if you view yourself as an athlete, or if you view yourself as you know, a family person, like at some point people identified you as that, and then that became a part of your identity. It became a part of who you are. So identity generally works this way. It's not something that intrinsically comes from within me. It's something that other people attach to me. It's a label I carry. And so for labeling theory, for Howard Becker, he wants to claim, just like in social learning theory, you learn other identities the same way. You learn your criminal identity the same way. You are given a criminal identity and it becomes a part of who you are. Labeling theory is really good at explaining one phenomenon that some of our other theories weren't particularly good at, which is recidivism. So people committing crimes and then committing more crimes again. In fact, getting caught for being caught committing a crime is a better determinant of continued criminality than not being caught, which is very interesting. So like if I get away with it, I'm less likely to do it again. But if I get caught, I'm more likely to do it again. This is a really great study by somebody we're going to look at later, who is a critical criminologist. Critical criminology and labeling theory, just like labeling theory and social learning theory, have a lot of borrowing. The critical criminologist is William Chambliss. And Chambliss did this study called The Saints and the Roughnecks, where he was studying people who steal cars to go joyriding. And he did this sort of like long extended study of these juveniles who got caught for joyriding and what happened to them in the system, and and basically like how that either threw them onto a trajectory of a life of crime, or it turned out to just be treated as something, a sort of boys will be boys, something they did when they were young. And a lot of it was determined by what happened to them punishment-wise. So people who are from poorer parts of town, which Chambliss calls the Roughnecks in his study, essentially what happens when they get caught is they almost always go into the juvenile system, and then they learn to view themselves as a criminal. For the people that he labels as the saints, the people from the wealthier part of town, generally if they get caught stealing a car, they get a slap on the wrist. Often they don't even get punished or fined or anything. They just get sort of sent home and get a stern talking to. And generally those people don't end up criminals, and they view this as this sort of fun lark thing they did when they were young. So that sort of shows the power of a label, right? Like if you can do the same action, but if you view it as something that makes you a criminal, you're more likely to commit more crimes. If you view it as something that's just done, right? If no label is attached to you, if it doesn't become a part of your identity, if other people don't identify you as a criminal for having done it, right? Then you're more likely to quit. You're more likely not to do it again. Okay, so that's sort of my introduction to labeling theory. So for this week, following the same format as last time, Wednesday you will post Friday, you will respond, by Friday, you can do it in between, you will respond to other people's posts, kind of create a little conversation. And yeah, so do that on the chapter from Howard Becker's The Outsiders that we have on Blackboard, and I will send you another video Monday, post another video Monday, next Monday, commenting on what happens. So have a great week. Hope everyone's being safe and healthy. If something happens, please let me know. I hear a lot more people that I'm connected to having gotten it, or known people who have gotten COVID-19 now. So as we move forward, please keep me informed on if something dramatic's happening in your family, or with friends, or if your energy needs to be placed elsewhere. So other than that, thank you and have a good week. Bye.